Welcome again, everyone. To all the newcomers, we'll get started in about 2 minutes on the dot, just about 7. If you want to type in where you're coming from in the chat, or who you're joining with, or what area, whatnot, feel free to pop that in and get to know each other a little bit before we get started. Nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd there too. Looks like 7 Pacific on the dot, so I'll start off just with some housekeeping. First off, welcome everybody, and great to see you all. Thanks for taking the time to join today. And as I said before, nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd. And welcome to the Key Biodiversity Areas in British Columbia update webinar. We'll have a couple of talks today, and then a kind of Q&A discussion period as well at the end. Should wrap up by 8:30 at the latest, and then if the Q&A doesn't have as many questions as we think, then might wrap up a little earlier. But some good time today to hear about the work going on and talk about it and whatnot. So the talk's being recorded as well, so we'll post that online in a couple of days. If you're RSVP'd to the Eventbrite, you'll get a link when that comes up, or a note when that goes live. And then if you check our KBA Canada website, you'll see that as well. It'll be eventually posted there. So keep your eye on either of those two spots. If you don't get an email and you don't want to check the website, feel free to shoot one of us an email and we can make sure to pass you a link to the recording as well. In terms of questions for today, we'll have 4 talks kind of back to back. If you have questions during either one, feel free to pop them in the chat or write them down. And at the end, we should have 30, 45 minutes, maybe more for questions. So you'll have a good chance to unmute yourself, turn on your camera and ask your questions and chat at that point too. So feel free to write those questions down or just save them for the end. I think that's all the housekeeping. If anyone else, any of my co-presenters have anything, feel free to jump in now. Otherwise, we'll move on to the first talk without further ado. So first one is me. I'm going to share my screen. My name is Peter Soroye. I'm already sharing my screen conveniently. My name is Peter Soroye. It's late where I am. I'm coming in from Ottawa, the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. It's about 10 p.m., but really excited to join today. The work in BC is super exciting, so really happy for the chance to talk a little bit about that and see some of the excitement around that building. I am our assessment and outreach coordinator with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, and so I work a little more at the national level than some of my colleagues here. But I'll be giving a presentation on an introduction, or for a lot of people here, a reintroduction to what key biodiversity areas are, what the work is that we're doing, who's involved in it, and why it's interesting and exciting. So I'll give a bit of an overview to the KBAs, get people on the same page, and then some of my colleagues will dive in with some more specific talks about work going on and who's involved and the different types of collaborations that are going on, some of the specific work with sites going on, what's being identified, how far are we to identifying all the KBAs in Canada, and then some talk on ecosystem KBAs as well. So we'll get a full wrap up, full overview of what's going on in BC with key biodiversity areas. Yeah, should be a good one. So to start off, for those who aren't familiar, what is a key biodiversity area? What's a KBA? We'll hear that acronym a lot today, probably a couple other acronyms as well. And key biodiversity areas, put simply, are sites that are disproportionately important for biodiversity. And there's two parts of that are particularly important that I'll highlight. One, that KBAs are sites, so they're kind of discrete locations and places we can put a boundary around, whether it's an ecological boundary or a management relevant boundary, but they're kind of discrete locations in space, as opposed to landscapes or broad areas and regions, or species of interest and things like that. There are also sites that are disproportionately important for biodiversity. So not every place that has a species at risk or a rare species is a key biodiversity area. A KBA is a place that's disproportionately important, significantly important for biodiversity. It's a place that meets some specific quantitative criteria. And so every site is meant to be a place where if that site were destroyed or degraded, then the species there, the ecosystems, would be at risk of disappearing from either Canada or from the planet as a whole. So every KBA is a really spectacular site and a disproportionately important one for a particular facet of biodiversity. The idea of KBAs comes from a lot of other tools that sought to do the same thing of identifying important places for nature. Some of these tools you'll be familiar with. Important bird areas, or the IDAs, obviously is a super popular program in BC and Canada and the rest of the world, and a big foundation for the key biodiversity area work. Other tools, things like important reptile and amphibian areas, or prime butterfly areas, important plant areas, Ramsar wetlands, or UNESCO World Heritage Sites, things like that. All of these different designations or tools, concepts, are other similar tools that identify important places for nature. And the idea of KBAs is that they try to wrap a lot of these tools under the same umbrella. They give us a single set of methods, a single set of criteria and approaches for identifying important places for biodiversity, both for species and ecosystems, and for even larger sites and sites that are important for landscapes and broader functioning of regions as well. And so the idea of KBAs is that they simplify the space, put a lot of these tools under the same umbrella. Instead of using 12 different tools, we can use 2 and then key biodiversity areas that account for a lot of other ones. That's the idea of KBAs. All these other tools are really important, and the idea of KBAs is that they build off them as well. So the idea of KBAs, they're scientifically robust, quantitative, and credible tool. Seeing no audio for some people. So I'll take a second just to try to address that. I don't know if other people can hear me fine. Seems like it. Okay, sorry about that, Deb. I'm not sure. I see your sign, but I'm not really sure if there's much I can do. It might be something on your end just to go into those audio settings and try to fix that. In the worst case, you can watch the recording afterwards, but I think we'll plow through and hopefully those can get addressed, maybe through the chat if someone can try to message as well. But sorry about that. So the idea of KBAs, I'll kind of try to go on so we can get to all the speakers as well. So the idea of KBAs is they're a quantitative tool, a credible one, a scientifically robust one, and they're just an information tool. So importantly, KBAs don't do anything on their own. When a site gets identified, it's not going to create a new protected area. It doesn't all of a sudden create a requirement to manage species in a certain way. The idea of KBAs is that they create just a piece of information, and that's something that people can use to support work that they're doing and inform different work that might be going on. And we'll touch on some of those uses later on as well. Sites, because the key biodiversity areas are an international tool, so they're a quantitative one that works across the globe. What allows this is that all sites have to meet a quantitative criteria based around importance for species or ecosystems. All of these criteria are very quantitative, so it adds a good transferability to the KBA tool. And so the same way that we identify, the same approaches we use to identify KBAs here in BC and Canada are the same that are being used in South Africa or Australia or Mozambique or the Congo or anywhere else in the world. So there's a cool international appeal to these KBAs and a transferability that's allowed by these quantitative and scientific criteria. The specific criteria for KBA sites are important for threatened biodiversity, rare biodiversity, so threatened and rare species. Looks like you got your audio back, Deb. Great to hear that. And thanks if someone was helping sort that out. So the specific criteria that KBAs are identified for threatened species and rare species, also threatened and rare ecosystems, for sites that are important for biological processes. So think of sites that are important for migration or for spawning of species, maybe for caribou calving or other kind of really significant life history events for species. And then there's a cool class of KBAs that's important for ecological integrity that I think Lucy will touch on later in the session today. But that's a category of KBAs that are identifying sites that are important for the broader functioning of landscapes and larger systems. So all of these different criteria, we could go in a lot more depth on them, but we'll just give a quick overview and you'll see some of the results of them later today. But if you're interested in kind of exploring these in more depth, reach out, and we have a KBA standards that goes in a lot more detail into what each of these are exactly entailing. The three kind of pillars of the KBA program are, in terms of our approach to identifying key biodiversity areas across the country and in BC, are really kind of centered on three things. One, being collaborative, trying to welcome as many different participants and experts and knowledge holders and interested parties as want to participate in the process. Trying to do the work in a comprehensive way and trying to make sure the information on KBAs is relevant and integrated within the work that's going on. So to touch on each of these a little bit more, the collaborative nature is something that's really critical. There's no way we can identify key biodiversity areas across the country without a literal army of experts and knowledge holders as well. There's such a wealth of knowledge that it would be foolish to just let that sit and not try to reach out. So no one organization can do this. It really relies on a huge network of experts and other folks who are supporting the work and spending their time and knowledge and energy supporting this work to identify and find these different sites. So that collaboration is a really key part of this process, and not just with experts, but with stakeholders and rights holders as well. We want to make sure that everyone who might be interested in using KBA information or should be aware of it is aware of it and has a chance to play a role in developing it as well. We want to make sure the work is comprehensive for a couple different reasons, but the biggest one is that if we identify a comprehensive set of KBAs, if we identify every KBA that could feasibly be identified across the country, that's going to create a really powerful tool for things like land use planning and different larger national or international initiatives. So that idea of identifying as full a set of KBAs or every KBA that we can is something that's really important for the eventual use of that information and for making sure we're not just picking out the best, a few of the best sites for nature. We're trying to identify all of these key biodiversity areas that meet that criteria. And of course, a lot of this is dependent on data availability and our understanding of species and where they are. So this is kind of always a work in progress, and our knowledge of KBAs and where they are will shift over time. But the idea is, based off the current knowledge we have and the expertise that's available in the country and abroad, we identify all the KBAs that we can. And finally, we want this information to be relevant. We don't want to create something that sits on a bookshelf or on a hard drive somewhere. We want to make sure this KBA information is useful, is relevant, and it builds off the tools that are already there. We don't want to reinvent the wheel and do something that's already been done by people before, 10 years ago or 30 years ago. We want to really make sure that we're building off the knowledge that's there, building off the expertise, and creating something that people can use immediately in the plans that they're building or to help get funding for work they're doing and things like that. And that goes alongside with being collaborative. We want to make sure everyone's involved so that this work is relevant to everybody. On that nature of kind of making the work of, making sure the work's collaborative, I want to quickly touch on as well the different groups that are involved in the KBA Canada program. So circled in the bottom right here, or the bottom left, sorry, are three of the NGOs that are leading the work nationally in Canada to identify key biodiversity areas. So Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, where I'm from and some of my colleagues are from today. Birds Canada, who's not here, but I'm sure folks are quite familiar with Birds Canada. I imagine a lot in the room. NatureServe Canada as well, who's probably a little less known of an organization, but are the ones who support the BC Conservation Data Center and who aggregate a lot of biodiversity information across BC and the rest of the country as well. So these three NGOs play a national role in coordinating the program. And then across the provinces, different provinces and territories, there are other organizations that also play really large roles. In BC, BC Nature is the biggest leader, probably among the biggest leaders in the country on the KBA work. None of the work in BC would be possible without the incredible leadership and expertise that BC Nature provides with the program. Outside of those four organizations, there's a larger network of groups, NGOs like NCC, Nature WCS Canada, WWF, Ducks Unlimited, and then some different provincial and territorial and federal agencies like Environment Climate Change Canada and others. And these are groups that are involved in what we call the KBA Steering Committee, or a little larger group called the KBA Canada Coalition. They're groups that are interested and play a pretty active role in advising or staying in the loop and kind of determining, kind of helping advise the KBA Canada program, or making sure they're aware of kind of the work that's going on and what's being done. Outside of that, there's a much larger KBA Canada community, which is other provincial, territorial, federal agencies and governments, experts, knowledge holders, indigenous organizations and groups, and individuals. A lot of experts, whether it's knowledge holders and academic partners or museum curators or others, even just amateur naturalists and others who are playing a really large role in helping identify KBAs and eventually we'll use this information as well, whether it's for education and awareness or informing monitoring or being used in land use plans and other things. So there's a really huge group is what the message I'm trying to pass on here. And that's just in Canada. Of course, globally, this is part of an international effort as well. And so Canada is one of many countries that are identifying key biodiversity areas across the globe. It's probably worth spending a little bit more time just quickly talking about the different roles and kind of the different ways that these groups are working together, because I think it's fascinating, the ways that these 4 organizations, especially here, are kind of working together in BC to do this work. It's really complex and often challenging work. And like I mentioned before, no one organization could do it. So it's really amazing, I think, kind of the collaboration and teamwork that's going on within the province of BC. That's really, among all the provinces and territories, some of the most exciting work on key biodiversity areas. And I'm not just saying that because it's the BC webinar, but it's truly a really kind of some really cool work. But it really relies on kind of the individual expertise that all these organizations have. Liam might touch on this a little bit more later on, and others might too, but BC Nature plays such an incredible role with connecting the program to local expertise and data and experts, many of which are in this room as well. And thanks for your participation and support so far. BC Nature's role as well with kind of on-the-ground monitoring and supporting local Indigenous outreach and engagement is just incredible. And again, could not do the rest of the KBA work without that. Birds Canada, you might know as well from the IBA work, and they're leading this crosswalk of transitioning their important bird areas to key biodiversity areas. And that bird-focused expertise that they have nationally across the country is really critical for leading KBA assessment and proposal development for these bird-focused sites that they're working on. WCS Canada, Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, is leading the work for assessing all of the other non-bird KBAs, and of course working closely with Bird Canada on sites that have both birds and non-birds. But that goes beyond species. There's also ecosystem KBAs that we'll hear about later as well. So WCS is leading a lot of that national assessment for these other KBAs. And we're also a central kind of coordination group for the different KBA review processes and quality control steps, making sure that every proposal is consistent with the global KBA standard and consistent nationally as well, of course. So if you've been involved in technical reviews or general reviews for KBAs, you might have had someone from WCS Canada reach out to you, given we're that kind of coordination group for a lot of that review process. And finally, I mentioned NatureServe Canada before. They're not as well known of an organization, but they're really amazing in the work that they do. And in terms of the KBA work, they've provided an incredible database of biodiversity data that we use for scoping out where KBAs are likely to be across the country. And they do a lot of really cool work developing ecosystem-based automated range maps for species, which is something that informs a lot of KBA work as well, or some KBA work too. I won't spend too much time talking about the process of KBAs. Again, I think this is maybe a nerdy niche that some people are probably really, really into, but for most, probably less exciting than talking about the actual sites and hearing more about the progress. But one thing I want to highlight about the process of identifying KBAs, which some folks might know and others might not, is that it's really iterative. And that diagram, I think that kind of comes out here. Every step of the way from the conception of a KBA to the delineation of boundaries and the different review steps, there's a chance to incorporate new information, new input, and new data. So there's always a chance to kind of, to inform KBAs and to hop in and participate in the process and collaborate It's a really iterative process, which is something that is really essential when we're talking about something with a lot of different folks who are collaborating together, especially lower capacity organizations like some NGOs and different Indigenous groups and First Nations and stuff as well. On that last note as well, that Indigenous outreach and collaboration aspect is something that's really central to the KB process as well. We want to make sure that KBAs, the information on them and the development of them is something that that there's been space for different types of collaboration and for folks to engage with. We're seeing a lot of really exciting collaborations with different First Nations across BC and across the rest of the country as well. Varying levels of interest, in general, but in a couple cases, a lot of really cool collaborations and a lot of really strong interest from different nations in using KBA information to support the work that's going on. And we've worked together to do things like delineate boundaries of KBAs together and add traditional place names to KBAs and even highlighting traditional species names and things like that. So a lot of really cool work together. It's a challenging process and a really long one, not a quick one, as many will know. But a really rewarding process, and it makes the KBA process a lot stronger that we have this space for Indigenous collaboration and engagement built in. Quickly, before I kind of turn it over to my colleagues, I just want to highlight a cool dashboard that, in the future, in between our next kind of BC webinars, this is a kind of a stopping point if you want to see the progress of KBAs. I'll drop the link for this in the chat, but it's our KBA Canada progress dashboard. And it's kind of an interactive terminal or portal where you can kind of look at different KBAs that are in progress and accepted across the country. Of course, our website is where you can download information on KBAs, but to see news about that progress, this is the place to go. You can see how many KBAs there are in BC left to be identified. And if you click on each of these points, you'll see what species they're being identified for and things like that. So this is available on our website. I'll drop a link in the chat once I'm done, but this is a great kind of stopping point if you're interested after today and kind of seeing where are we with identifying KBAs in BC. And the last thing I'll leave people with too is how this information is being used, because I think that's a really exciting part of it and something that now we're quite a few years into the program, about 4 years into kind of comprehensively starting to really fully identify sites. We're starting to see a lot of really cool uses of KBA information. In a couple different ways, in a kind of national, international way. There's a lot of interest in using KBAs as an indicator of progress towards different global biodiversity targets. Environment Climate Change Canada, for example, is really keen on using KBAs as one of the layers they use to inform where they focus their protected areas, their new protected areas for 30 by 30, protecting 30% of lands and waters by 2030. So KBAs are feeding into the international effort for there as one of the layers, among others. In BC, the land use planning team is also quite interested in using KBAs to inform different work. And so we're seeing a lot of use of KBAs in that, trying to target those priority areas for biodiversity, where we can get the biggest bang for our conservation buck and things like that. We're also seeing examples of KBAs starting to feed into land use planning at different nations and within other NGOs and different kind of communities, even municipalities and provinces. We're seeing KBAs start to feed into and start to result in benefits to stewardship and restoration work, people getting more funding because they're mentioning KBAs or getting to access to different resources and things like that. I mentioned this before, but different First Nations are really interested and other Indigenous groups are interested in using KBAs to support their Indigenous-led conservation, whether Indigenous protected and conserved areas, IPCAs, or other work as well. And we're seeing a lot of education and inspiration around KBAs, which I think is really neat as well. A lot of these places are already really protected, really well known, but it never hurts to have a spotlight to shine and talk a little bit more about them. And for a lot of these species, caribou on this slide are a species that gets a lot of attention, but other things like that blue-gray tail dropper slug that was there a few slides back, different lichen and things like that. A lot of, less charismatic species are getting a spotlight from KBAs as well, which is really cool to see. There's a lot of exceptional biodiversity in BC and Canada, and it never hurts to be able to talk about it, have an excuse to talk about it a little more. So my final slide, I'll just give a quick shout out to everybody on the team working actively on KBAs. Everybody kind of in red and bolded here is our folks who are working pretty actively in BC and who you might have heard from in the past or you might hear from in the future on KBAs. And I'll drop our emails in the chat as well. Everyone who's here today. So if anyone wants to reach out, you can do so, please do. And I'll just show our website as well, kbacanada.org. We'll drop it in the chat if you haven't seen it already. It's a really great website. And for, in between the next KBA webinar, that'll be your kind of go-to place to learn more about KBAs or see where we're at. On that note, I'll wrap it up for me. If you have questions, please pop them in the chat or save them for the end. And I'll turn it over to Liam Ragan to talk a little bit about some more of the work that's going on.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for all the comments for BC too. You had me blushing there. Let me quickly share a screen here. All right. Can everyone see that okay? Perfect. And also to confirm, can you see my slides and not all my speaker notes?
Yep. Looks like just the slides.
Perfect. So there's a couple folks in here from the Salt Spring talk, or from Nature Salt Spring, and I gave a talk there recently. They could see all my speaker notes. So always want to double check now. You know who you are. Anyhow, my name is Liam Ragan. I am the First Nations Liaison for Key Biodiversity Areas in BC, as well as the Provincial Coordinator for Important Bird Areas. I work for BC Nature in close collaboration with WCS Canada and Birds Canada, and I live here in Victoria on the territory of the Songhees First Nation. I have sort of two categories of slides here I'm going to be talking about today. The first is a quick catch up on where we're at with some of our newer bird-based KBAs. Those slides were done by Molly Bradford, our close collaborator with Birds Canada, who unfortunately can't be here today. And then that will dovetail into my my slides on the work we've done to engage with First Nations in BC on Key Biodiversity Areas. So yeah, like Peter said, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. You also have my email here. Please feel free to reach out if anything here strikes your fancy, gives you ideas. You go, oh my God, I have a super large database of marble murrelet data on the West Coast. If only someone had asked. You'll make me very, very happy. So yeah. So IB to KBA transition. I'm assuming most people in here are fairly familiar with important bird areas. Very much the same as what Peter described earlier, but obviously deal only with birds. They were brought to BC in the 90s and through a partnership between Birds Canada and BC Nature, and were highly successful. We have 83 in British Columbia and also sponsored the development of a IBA caretaker program for the country, which essentially looked at the question of, okay, we've established these sites. What do we want to do next? And we worked with our network of naturalist clubs to find volunteers to sort of take up the mantle and make sure those sites remained monitored and that conservation action was taken. Through the transition to key biodiversity areas, we've been involved in assessing these sites to make sure they still meet the similar thresholds. So have populations changed? Are there new populations? And crucially, are there populations of non-bird species that we need to be using to highlight these? I always like to say, you have a site like Douglas Lake Plateau that has, 1% of the world's sandhill crane population. They're not going there because they just love the greater Kamloops real estate. They're going there because of the ecological community that makes that site unique. And so through key biodiversity areas, I think we're able to paint a much more holistic picture of why these sites are important and why they need to be protected. So how is that being done? First off, we are harvesting huge amounts of data through nature counts. As Peter said, they're one of the core partners of the program. We are updating all species based on global and national estimates, and we are seeking volunteer input from our naturalist clubs, our caretakers, naturalists throughout the province and farther to make sure that we're telling the best story possible. And we are partnering with First Nations to make sure all data is included and different types of knowing are included in these sites. So for a couple of examples of some of these bird-based KBAs, or rather sites that include birds that I can update folks on, because as many of you know, I kind of mostly only deal with birds, as you will probably find out when I have to talk about lichens later in this presentation. One of our most recently published KBAs is Skookumchuck Prairie, which is a pristine grassland area over in the Kootenays. It supports a nationally significant breeding population of Lewis's woodpecker, the woodpecker pictured here. And as many of you likely have heard, Nature Canada recently purchased a large plot to protect those grasslands. I also wanted to put the plug in here that we're quite proud of the work that our clubs and partners have done to ensure the site gets to this stage. The Rocky Mountain Naturalist Club and our IBA caretaker, Diane Cooper, have really led a large part in bringing together a huge multi-sectional community ranging from hunters to bird watchers to ATVers to people worried about fire buffers to basically combat a number of development proposals that have gone through in the last couple of years. And yeah, we're really proud to see the site now getting recognized as a KBA. Oh, let me see. Next, we have the Comox and Chehalis River Estuary, both KBAs that are currently in general review, so should be getting recognized shortly. They're both examples of IBAs where we've been able to add a number of non-bird species to the site. So on the left here, you can see Comox, known mostly for the herring spawn, when it brings in tens to hundreds of thousands of everything from surf scoters to gulls to oyster catcher. We've been able to add in Pacific herring, the endemic subspecies, or not subspecies, but I believe it's a form of Western brook lamprey, Macoon's meadowfoam, and Coast microceras. Similarly, at the Chehalis River Estuary, known for its enormous bald eagle aggregations and overwintering trumpeter swan, we've been able to expand the site's designation to Oregon spotted frog, sockeye salmon, and Western dune skipper. Dune skipper? I can't remember. Next, we have the Scott Island group. Also, many of you know this area is Triangle Island. This is a site where kind of one of those easy slam dunks. There is no possible way this site isn't going to become a KBA, as it's one of the largest breeding islands in the country. It holds about a third of the world's Cassin's auklet population, huge numbers of rhinoceros auklet, tufted puffin, and now, as we transition to a KBA, a Steller sea lion. There are a number of other species and sort of endemic subspecies that we're looking at the site for, but these are the ones that we can 100% confirm. And this has been the result of huge amounts of consultation with Canadian Wildlife Service biologists, just to make sure that even if we don't have year by year, here's exactly the number of Cassin's auklet estimates that we have, we can say, look, this site has so well in excess of 1% of the world's Cassin's auklet, like we can model, at the most basic level to say this is easily a KBA. Another site, Squamish River area. This is a great example of sites where we're looking for input from the public. This site has been historically monitored by the Squamish Environment Society Squamish Streamkeepers, one of our clubs, as well as our two IBA caretakers, Chris Dale and John Buchanan. We are currently in the process of trying to assess it for glaucous wing gull. It's currently data deficient, but we have strong indications historically that during the salmon run, this site hosted huge global percentages of glaucous wing gull. And so we're now working with our club and caretakers to try and up the Christmas bird count, perhaps expand out a little bit on either side of that Christmas bird count to catch what's going on during the salmon run and demonstrate that. But in the meantime, we are able to say that it meets KBA thresholds for Roll's Brothorella moss, which is a nice little stopgap, make sure that no matter what, the site does get recognized. Another great example of an area where we have been relying on community and experts to provide input are our marbled murrelet sites on Vancouver Island. For those unaware, marbled murrelet, globally endangered seabird that nests in old growth, and there are quite a few sites in BC designated for it based on that conservation status. Many of our sites, especially on Vancouver Island, are data deficient due to the fact that it's very hard to survey these sites. I'll talk a little bit more on that later in the First Nations aspect. But we are currently seeking input from experts and modelers to hopefully be able to say, even if there haven't been recent surveys, we can still confidently say that there are high thresholds being met at these sites. Other sites, I'll put this up just for a minute. We do obviously have a couple presenters. I don't want to dwell too long on this, but here's a list of sites. If any of these are in your area and you think, hey, I have some data I could contribute to that, I did some counts that might not be on their radar, please feel free to email me. You have my contact info from the first slide. I'll put it in the chat again after this. But just as an example of, we really are relying on the community to make this program work. Since the beginning, it has been a hugely reliant on the public program. I always like to say sometimes when we're talking to fundraisers, they're like, oh, how did it go with the one survey? And I go, oh, one survey, we did 50. And they go, how did you make that happen? And I get to say, oh, because we have so many folks, such as many here in the on the webinar today, who really like to go out, count birds and look at species at risk. And so we're able to really get these legions of volunteers out to make the work happen. So that concludes the kind of quick rundown on where we're at with some of the newer bird-based KBAs. You have Molly's email there. Feel free to reach out to her for any data questions or if you yourself have data. And yeah, that brings us to the next section, which is just a little bit about how we are engaging with First Nations on KBAs in BC. This has been an enormous project, one that I am very, very proud of. And yeah, I guess we'll get right into it. Out of curiosity, for those of you with your chats open, do you want to take a quick guess at how many different First Nations are in BC? About 10 seconds for that. Wild guesses. I guess there are technically wrong answers, but in the context of this webinar, there are no wrong answers. All right. Mid-hundreds, mid-200s, low-200s. Very, very well done. Here is a quick screenshot from Native Land, which seeks to map all traditional territories. The answer to that is it's not 100% clear. There are many nations that either just overlap or have disputed overlaps. But the point is there are a ton of Indigenous communities and Indigenous proponents throughout the province. And as anyone who's worked in the not-for-profit or consulting sector knows, knowing even the most basic who to consult with can sometimes in and of itself be an enormous barrier to effective engagement. And so the way that we have gone about this has been threefold. The first has been collaborative outreach. As Peter mentioned in his talk, this work is only possible through collaboration between WCS Birds Canada and BC Nature, as well as an absolute plethora of clubs, community partners, and other supporters. And we applied that same methodology to First Nations consulting in BC. The second one is extensive planning. We, in our first phase of scoping, took over 4 months to make sure we were consulting every database we could, be it government, be it community, be it open source, such as this one here, to make sure that we weren't excluding any communities or nations just because they, say, hadn't uploaded a community shape file to the forestry data set, whatever you might have. We brought together every one of those we could find and then cross-reference it against other known sources to make sure that we had every community in there. We then overlaid that with our known KBA values, sites we were looking at, sites that we thought either were going to or could become KBAs, and then added a buffer on that to make sure that we additionally weren't going to miss any communities, and came up with our list of both Indigenous proponents and which KBAs are within their territories. The third piece is consistent outreach, and that essentially comes down to a multi-organizational database, which we built with WCS and Birds Canada, which I now understand has been used throughout the country, kind of based on the model we worked out here. And that essentially just ensured that outreach was consistent. We were able to say, regardless of if it was WCS, BC Nature, or Birds Canada doing the outreach to any one nation, that we were all putting our notes in the same place. We were all touching base when we were reaching out, and coordinated engagement. We weren't all three of us saying to the same person, like, hey, let's talk about this moss, this bird, this caribou, this what you have. But we were kind of being respectful of their limited capacity to engage by kind of taking that organizational burden on ourselves to make sure we were kind of doing our best up front. So some of the results of that, we were able to identify 214 Indigenous proponents in BC who had KBA values within their territories. You notice I say Indigenous proponents and not First Nations. That's because in our effort to make sure that we didn't miss engaging with anyone, we listed anything from communities, band offices, treaty associations, and then from there on, reach out to say, hey, is this something you would work on? You know, many times got back like, no, we only work on treaty stuff, but please, you know, make sure to work with this band office, this nation, etc. And through that, we believe we've made sure that there have been no kind of major missed engagements. This is also highly dependent on local community contexts, which is something I'm going to talk a little bit more about. Context is super key to effective engagement. One of the things that we have one of the reasons we've been able to succeed in our engagement has been that we really try and meet communities where we're at. We're not coming in saying, we know about this endangered butterfly and you need to tell us all about it right now, or we're not going to be able to do this. We kind of get to go and reach out to a wide swath of First Nations to say, hey, look, here's what the KBA program is. Here's what it isn't. If this is of interest to you, we very graciously have we very luckily have some funding available from some of our partners. We would love to support engagement here. And if you are too busy right now, if this isn't a priority for you, if it's just not something you want to invest limited capacity in right now, we're going to be around. We have been for decades. We will hopefully be for decades to come. We'll check back in with you in 6 months or a year. And I think because of that, we are able to, or we've been able to see some of the success like outlined here. Using that process, we've reached out to exactly 120 different Indigenous proponents so far. Engagement has ranged everything from simple, hey, we think there might be a KBA in your area. Here's the information we have. Are you interested? Let's chat. To, hey, this endangered fish species is very undersurveyed. Do you want to get on a boat together and we'll go check it out, talk about it, talk to elders, work with youth, find out information from your guardians, etc., and so on. I'm going to give 2 examples after this of areas where we've really kind of deepened engagement and put this into action. But yeah, just to kind of outline that engagement has many forms, and going back to kind of community context has been dependent on the capacity and interests of those different communities. And finally, we have 30 agreements secured. As I said, these kind of range from, cool, we looked over your proposal, we don't see any concerns, talk about how endangered this lizard is till the cows come home, maybe put a word in here, to, hey, we have an idea for a key biodiversity area. Will you come and work with us to survey all the birds at this herring spawn and perhaps assess what tonnage of herring is in here and if that meets global, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Going insofar as having First Nations being the ones themselves nominating key biodiversity areas. So those agreements take quite a few different forms. I know I'm a little bit over my 10 minutes, so I don't want to take too much time here, but just to give 2 examples of kind of what these partnerships have looked like, and 2 that we're quite proud of, are, first off, we have the Tobacco Plains First Nation, who were instrumental in designating the Tobacco Plains Key Biodiversity Area. That was done largely thanks to Ian, who's here and going to be talking later, and was designated for Spalding's campion, which is an endangered in Canada flower. This area is the only site in Canada where they're found, and as well as makes up about 3% of the global population. We, again, thanks to our partners at WCS, were made aware that the nation was involved in habitat restoration and was looking for conservation monitoring support to assess the effectiveness of that habitat restoration. And so thanks to funding from Environment Canada, we were able to work together on an agreement whereby we provided them with some autonomous recording units and oversight to essentially install these recording devices throughout the areas being restored, so that we could monitor over a long term what the habitat restoration was doing for both species diversity and abundance. This is in its infancy. These were just delivered this year, and we're really looking forward to the next, I believe it's 5 years the agreement goes for. But yeah, just an example of key biodiversity areas as a way of leveraging kind of conservation recognition into conservation action, as well as supporting the actual Indigenous proponents on the ground who are doing the work to make sure these sites remain significant to these species. The other site I want to talk about quickly is the Heshkit Lake area. We've been working here for 3 years with the Heshkit First Nation through our IBA caretaker, Diane Ignis, who, alongside her family, are the Heshkit stewards of the harbor. This, I think, represents exactly what we're about here, in that it was only possible because of a wide range of partnerships, including BC Field Ornithologists, who provided the original seed funding, Environment Canada, who provided us the following funding to make the follow-up trips possible, Raincoast Education Society, who provided the local connections and insight, and the University of Victoria Birdwatching Club, where we had a bunch of teenagers and young adults come and say, we want to survey marbled murrelets. And I went, holy crap, I don't know how to do that. Let's figure this out. Anyone, if you ever want to chat more about that, yeah, fanatic about the story. But yeah, so our first year we went in and effectively said there hasn't been marbled murrelet surveys done since, I believe at that point it was the late 80s or early 90s, ironically by the former president of BC Nature, who helped develop the methodology for the province. We were able to go in, thanks to the partners I listed over there, and borrow a radar device, go out at 2 a.m., set it up, and say, you know what, there are still significant numbers of marbled murrelet in this harbor. Interestingly, we saw lower than historic counts, but we were able to say, while we don't have globally significant numbers based on this survey, we can still demonstrate that there are nationally significant numbers. Our hope is, again, pending funding, we can go back and confirm that there may be more than we picked up on that 1 year, because as anyone here knows, 1 year does not robust data set make. But more importantly, what came out of that was talking to the Heskett First Nation of, okay, marble murals weren't your top priority, but this is kind of how we were able to leverage funds to come in and do this work to start. What are your priorities going forward? And what we heard were herring, the herring spawn, the herring spawn, the herring spawn. The name Heskett actually refers to the sound of eating herring eggs off of eelgrass. If I don't know why anyone here would have done that, but if you have, you maybe have a sense of what I'm talking about. They essentially said, look, we have this herring spawn here. There's been not a lot of work or any work on the birds at this spawn. If you wanted to come and try and see, what's going on here, we think we would have some pretty large populations. So we've just done 2 years of that, wrapped up our month and a half of field work. This is what, April. And we are very happy to report that based on that work, we were able to show easily hitting thresholds for Brandt's cormorant, the little blue-eyed guy there, with high counts of almost 3,000 or nearly 2% of the global population, as well as Iceland gull, the bird on the bottom there, with high counts almost 1,500 or just about 2% of the national population. We suspect that if this site got the coverage that some of the other more accessible herring spawn sites did, we would add quite a few more species. And luckily, there's a lot of excitement from the nation to continue working with them. And we hope to continue this partnership to be able to paint a more holistic picture of why this site is so significant. In the other than birds, we were also quite excited this year to discover a fairly large population of seaside centipede lichen, photographed on the left there. Listed as threatened by Kosiwik. This has a highly restricted range and was not known from the area, but we were able to identify over 100 individuals on 21 different trees, which we believe will meet KBA thresholds, and again, paint a more broad picture of why this area is so biodiverse and is so important, as well as on the right there, Hibberson's trillium. This was a known site for that. We weren't quote unquote, discovering anything. But this is a unique species endemic to Vancouver Island, listed as threatened by Kosiwik, which is only known from a small handful of sites, and is going to be added to the eventual KBA as a flagship species. So yeah, that's everything I want to talk about today. Of course, a quick thanks to our core funders, Chalkers Foundation, Environment Canada, Sitka Foundation, WCS, and BC field ornithologists, to name a few. And a final thanks as well to all the partners who make this work possible, the First Nations who have hosted us, supported us, brought us out on their boats, kept us alive, helped us count birds, the IBA caretakers who provide the local context to make a lot of this work possible and make sure we know where to go, when to go there, and also how to stay alive. And very similarly, the naturalist clubs who provide volunteers, funding, support, and yeah, make it all possible. So thank you very much. And that back over to you, Peter.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll turn it over to Ian right away.
There we are. Find my mute button. Sorry about that. Yes, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Get my share here. And screen. There we are. So how's that look? We've got full screen, not my speaker notes.
Looks good.
Thanks all. Thank you, yeah, Peter, Liam, Luce for presenting tonight. Thank you everyone for taking some time out of your spring evening to join us on this discussion of key biodiversity areas around BC. I'll provide a detailed update on where we're at in the process of identifying KBAs, a few stats, and we'll look at an example of a KBA, provide a bit of background on the process of how we bring these sites to completion. Peter touched on the process of the iterative process that we go through with this. I'll sort of quickly walk through an example of that. So to date, we have 27 different sites published, completed, and on the registry across BC. You can see here the areas that are outlined in green. Some of the smaller ones that don't show up at this scale are marked with a star. Part of the KBA process, as Liam has outlined, is migrating important bird areas to the KBA umbrella where they meet KBA thresholds, and we have over 80 KBAs that identified to date, or 83 of the KBAs that are being moved into the KBA umbrella. Over 200 KBAs total have been drafted to date. We'll look at that. Sizes range quite widely from small urban green space to large areas, both ocean and terrestrial areas. Zoom in a bit here to the south coast, where there's a number of KBAs published to date and more on the works. This is a list of ones that are complete to date. And if we zoom in a little bit closer into the capital region and southern Vancouver Island, we can see Oak Bay in particular is could well be the KBA capital of Canada. Within Oak Bay itself has 6 different KBAs that are recognized for the listed species that occur there. Now on the map, the default if you look at KBACanada.org, the Explore page on here, and look at the map viewer, Peter provided a link for that in the chat, then you'll see the default is just those green areas. If in the lower right-hand corner, you click on the candidate Key Biodiversity Area option here, you'll spray paint the map with a number of orange dots. And this will show you the candidate sites. If you click on each of these, it'll give you a bit of information about what they are. Here I want to sort of particularly sort of look at Haida Gwaii. And here, Jean, it's on the chat beforehand, Jean had asked about Lasky Bay area and its involvement with Haida Gwaii. Haida Gwaii is a very special place, special provincially, nationally, and globally. We're working to develop a relationship with the Council of Haida Nation to determine the possible KBAs at Haida Gwaii. The bevy of orange dots that you see here in Haida Gwaii are primarily IBAs that are identified in the 1990s, and most of them are data deficient, being worked on at revisiting those. There was a workshop also a number of years ago for possible botanical KBAs that was early on in the KBA process. It was before my time. It's quite possible that the entire archipelago will be one KBA site, and all those orange dots will be one, and the entire archipelago will just be one large green area at the end. That will depend on where the discussions go with Council of Haida Nation and where we're at there. Jean, more to your question about Lasky Bay. I believe Lasky Bay Conservation Society has been engaged with some of those early discussions. Maria Leung, our colleague, is leading the Haida Gwaii portion of our KBA process. It's always a fairly slow slow process when we're going through these fairly careful discussions. We look at this by region. Here we have the number in red, the number of KBAs in each of the natural resource regions around the province. It shows a fairly strong number on the southern part of the province, which isn't a big surprise. These numbers do not include about 26 or so KBAs that have been initially identified, but are now largely classified as dormant. These are sites where we are lacking data, or there's just not going to be enough information to move them forward at this time. That does not mean they will never be KBAs, just means we have to wait and hopefully we get more information down the road. These also don't include the potential ecosystem KBAs or ecological integrity-based KBAs that Lucy Poley will be discussing shortly. So these are strictly species-based KBAs. A few fun facts about KBAs that we've identified to date. Again, 229 sites that are around the province that are in some level of work. 27 of those are published. And across those 221 sites, we have 260 elements or taxa. When we talk about species, one of the main differences with global KBAs and national KBAs is global level, we can only go down to the species level of taxonomy. Nationally, we can go to subspecies levels, populations, things that CSIC identifies. We'll talk a bit more about CSIC here in a moment and what that is for those of you not familiar with it. Main example here is caribou. If we were doing a caribou KBA globally, we would have to look at all caribou, all reindeer across Russia, Scandinavia, Canada, Greenland, US, everywhere. You'd probably never find a caribou KBA. In Canada, we've decided that there are nationally significant conservation units for species such as caribou, and therefore we take the CSIC model of designatable units, or in the States is known as evolutionary significant units. And those are separate populations that are eligible to be KBA. So we can look at southern mountain caribou, we can look at prairie caribou, barren ground caribou, and we can find KBAs that are ecologically important, nationally important for those. So that's when we talk about elements rather than species. The maximum size, the largest KBA we have is actually straddles the BC-Alberta border. It's Narroway. The largest one solely in BC is Heart Ranges for central mountain caribou. The smallest one is Trafalgar Park in Oak Bay at 1.6. It's 1.6 hectares. Median size of the caribous, or the KBAs across BC, is a little over 38 square kilometers. The average actually is several hundreds, about 340 square kilometers. It's much higher, and it shows the skew of several large KBAs that we have. The species that show up in the most KBAs is Salish sucker. There's currently 12 KBAs in the works in the Lower Mainland to identify for Salish sucker, which is a federally endangered species of fish. Interestingly, there's about 55 sites or so that have no provincial or federal protected area within them, or that are completely outside of any sort of protected area currently. This excludes things like wildlife management areas, wildlife habitat areas, but it does show the importance of identifying KBAs and the potential for identifying future protected areas, both federally and provincially. And finally, shout out to the South Okanagan, which has the greatest number of elements in Canada, 45 and counting species, additional 6 at least that we're aware of that are data deficient that would contribute to it. It's rather complex KBA and covers one of the most endangered ecosystems in Canada. In fact, the sagebrush steppe ecosystem that occurs there also will trigger for KBA status. We look at a breakdown by taxon, by far, or the two major ones, of course, vertebrate animals and vascular plants. The vertebrate animals are populated largely by birds, which isn't a surprise given the number of important bird areas that are becoming KBAs. But it shows certainly the diversity of taxa that are informing our KBAs. If we take a look at this a bit closer and break those down, it gets even more interesting. We've got plants divided into both dicots and monocots. A couple of conifers, both white bark pine and limber pine, are KBA triggers in the southeast corner in the Castle Waterton Acamina KBA. A number of butterflies and other invertebrates, gastropods, 8 different snails and slugs that are forming KBAs. And you can see over here, almost 50 bird species, 7 reptiles. A note here again that elements, for instance, in reptiles, this includes 2 different designatable units of sharp-tailed snake. CSIC recently split sharp-tailed snake into both a mainland population that is only known from the Mackenzie-Pemberton area, a key biodiversity area, and the population on Vancouver Island and several Gulf Islands. So those are distinct units, and they count as sort of a double count there under the reptiles. But an interesting breakdown there of the number of different types of taxa that are informing KBAs. Now, KSILIC, that I've mentioned a few times, for those of you not familiar with it, it's the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. It's the scientific body that assesses species at risk in Canada. Given that one of the KBA criteria is for threatened biodiversity, the criteria have species that are listed as either endangered or threatened by KSILIC. We can also use species that are listed as critically endangered, or vulnerable by IUCN, and also under our NatureServe, our data partner that assesses every species, every element essentially in Canada and the United States. Ones that are, they rank them from a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is critically imperiled and 5 is apparently secure. Elements that are globally and nationally at rank 1 or 2 are eligible for KBA. You can see here that the number of, certainly there's a bias for endangered species by Kasiwik within our listing, but there's 93 that have not been assessed at all by Kasiwik that are still meeting KBA criteria. 8 species that were assumed not at risk by Kasiwik are also still eligible as KBAs. So it's a demonstration that KBAs go well beyond just endangered wildlife and species to include all different types of options where they meet this criteria. Finally, an example here of how we go through it. And I've chosen a KBA that is currently in draft form. As noted, I've shown the line work here. This is subject to change until it is approved and published. So I ask that you don't copy it or quote it. It's shown here for draft purposes only. This is the northern tip of the Cascades ecosystem. So it's an ecosystem that's coming up from the United States and just gets over the border east of Vancouver in the Fraser Valley area. This has 100% of the national population of bugbane, the tall bugbane, the coast range sculpin, of course, Cultus lake sockeye, coastal giant salamander. There's roughly half of the national population of phantom orchid and cliff paintbrush, as measured by the number of localities, the number of element occurrences. Has over 10% of the national population, national range of mountain beaver, and 15 to 20% of both the Oregon forest snail and Pacific water shrew. Mountain beaver is very interesting as a small rodent, not related to beavers at all, for those of you not familiar with it. It is in its own family within the rodent order Aplodontidae. It is the only species in that family, and it is the only family of mammals that is endemic to North America. So they are only known from North America. It's a rather unique species, and this has a large proportion of its Canadian range. This KBA started off with 4 or 5 different smaller KBAs from Vedder Mountain in the southwest corner of the current KBA, the east side of Chilliwack Lake on the east side. There was Cultus Lake itself that had the sculpin and sockeye populations. Other areas within the middle of it that were looking at the tall bugbane and the coastal giant salamander. A couple of these species are, such as the giant salamander, that occur throughout here. Tall bugbane has a fairly wide distribution through here. Were difficult to narrow down to, okay, where are these, the areas within here? We have these smaller areas, and after a few discussions with some of the experts that are familiar with the sites, with the species, became clear that it was best just to take the entire watershed. So we delineated it to the entire watershed. It adds a bit to the northeast corner of the Cheam area that is outside of the Chilliwack watershed, but otherwise it is delineated to that area. This allows us to capture high elevation species like cliff paintbrush down to lower elevation species like the Oregon forest snail. So it is sort of an example of the iterative process that we go through in identifying and where to draw the lines on the map and what to include and perhaps what to exclude. At this point, we then write up a description of the area. We outline the conservation actions and challenges that the KBA faces, including threats. This is then reviewed by experts familiar with each taxa, as well as land managers, regional governments, rights holders, major stakeholders, and other interested parties. We've reached out to the Stolo Nation, who is the traditional territory on whose area this occurs, and continuing to work with them as much as possible. The extensive review takes time, and there's a large reason why we have so many KBAs that remain in the process and just 27 that are fully complete. It's also what gives them their strength, however, and their street cred. We believe it's the right thing to do to ensure that the sites have meaning and the conservation importance. So that's all for me. I will turn it over now quickly to colleague Lucy Poley, who's talk a bit about the ecosystem aspects.
Thank you, Ian and Liam and Peter. And it's so amazing to see so many people here. That's awesome. So give me 1 second to share my screen and find the correct slides. Are you seeing the right thing?
Looks good, although we're on presenter mode. So
Oh no, preview. Okay. Excellent. Thanks, Peter.
there we go.
Okay. So we've heard a lot about species so far, but I think one of the really powerful things about the KBA criteria is that they recognize that species are not the only important elements of biodiversity, and that actually ecosystems are important too. The whole ecosystem, the suite of interactions that occur amongst the species and the abiotic and biotic factors that live within them. So within the KBA standard, we also find criteria that identify KBAs based on the presence of ecosystems in areas of high ecological integrity. And as I'm sure we are all aware, BC is home to a magical variety of wonderful ecosystems, and a number of these could meet both of these or one or both of these criteria. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the ecosystem criteria. Now, this work is complicated in a different way than the species criteria, and we haven't advanced to the point of identifying any sites in BC yet, although we know there will be some. But I'll give you a background about how it will work and what we've done so far. So first of all, here's a little quick breakdown of the 3 criteria within the KBA standard that work for ecosystems. First of all, we have criterion A2, which deals similarly to what Ian showed us for threatened species. It deals with threatened ecosystem types. So these KBAs hold a significant proportion of the full amount of a threatened ecosystem. So it needs to be designated globally as either critically endangered, or threatened. And that means basically it's nearing or very close to be collapsing. And essentially, unlike species that go extinct, it doesn't disappear and there's just a blank space of an ecosystem. Instead, basically, it becomes so degraded that it can no longer be called that ecosystem type. And usually that degradation occurs from conversion to some sort of anthropogenic activity or another ecosystem type. So in these ecosystem types, the more endangered it is, the less you have to have within a KBA for it to qualify. So it's 5% at least of all of that ecosystem if it's globally critically endangered or endangered, and then 10% of that ecosystem in a site if it's vulnerable. Criterion B4 deals with geographically restricted or rare ecosystem types. So these KBAs would hold a significant proportion of the extent of any type of ecosystem. It doesn't have to be designated as any kind of threat level, but generally these ecosystems, they're rare, essentially, because the site has to hold 20% or more of all of that ecosystem, either in Canada or in the world. So with a really widespread ecosystem, it would be hard to make a compact site that holds at least 20%. So this is more of an ecosystem type that doesn't occur in a lot of places. And then finally, there's criterion C, which deals with this concept of ecological integrity. And these KBAs are designed to identify what we call the truly outstanding examples at the global scale of still natural and intact places. And these are supposed to be sites that are basically undisturbed by significant industrial human disturbance. So these sites should be the best of the best. We're limited to only 2 per ecoregion, which is a broad scale way of defining units of land based on essentially climate and landform. So within each ecoregion in Canada, only the 2 best of sites can qualify for criterion C. It needs to be healthy, so containing very little to no industrial development, as well as intact lands, waters, species, and all the interactions amongst those. And finally, these are supposed to be large, so at least 10,000 square kilometers in size. So we'll first talk about the first 2 KBA types for ecosystems, A2 and B4, and then we'll go into criterion C. In order to identify A2 and B4 ecosystem KBAs, we need to know 3 things about the ecosystem. We need to have an understanding of the full distribution of that ecosystem. It needs to be classified at an appropriate level, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And we need a map, basically, because as you've seen, KBAs are very map-based. They're very spatial. So we need to know where this ecosystem is, what it is, and how much of it is in different places. And then as I noted on the previous slide, for those A2 KBAs, we need to know how threatened they are. So what is the threat status of the ecosystem? And there is a set assessment methodology for determining how threatened an ecosystem is that we're supposed to apply in the KBA standard. And then finally, within the boundary of a site, we need to know how much of the total ecosystem extent is there, and does it meet those thresholds that I showed you on the previous slide. So in terms of ecosystem classification and mapping, British Columbia has excellent provincial ecosystem classifications and systems. They've been applied for decades and developed over time. They are amazing and wonderful. So this is a little bit complicated to explain in detail. Some people might be more familiar with the classifications than others, but basically there's different hierarchies and they're all sort of nested and related to each other, and that's how you understand the ecosystem type. So at a broad scale, BC has what's called a biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification. And I bet a lot of people have seen this map. Basically, this uses climax vegetation communities or mature vegetation communities to infer the ecological effects of climate and soil at a pretty broad scale or at large regions. And at the highest levels, the province is divided into 14 biogeoclimatic zones, which are large geographic areas with a relatively uniform climate. And then over on the other side, we can go to the vegetation and the site level. So I'm going to use the Garry Oak Ocean Spray plant or ecological community as an example in the next few slides. Basically, a plant association is a grouping of species that you would see reoccurring at similar sites across the landscape. And then throughout the site classification, we get to the site association, which is sort of the physical location where these plant groupings occur. And like I said, these things are nested. So the Garry Oak Ocean Spray ecological community only occurs within the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone. So everything's all nested and related, and it's really cool. We've mentioned, I think, the BC Conservation Data Center once or twice. They have amazing data. So if we type in Garry Oak Ocean Spray, not only can we find information about that community, a little summary and some information about it, we can also find some mapped data on that community. And you'll see some of those very circular blobs. Those are just obscured locations where basically the CDC doesn't want to give away the exact location of a sensitive ecosystem, or the mapping is not super precise. So they're not actually circular occurrences of that, but that's just an example of the mapping that you can get from this piece, Ecosystem Explorer. So I also mentioned the classification of the ecosystem. So it's specified in the KBA standard that for a site identification, we require ecosystems classified at intermediate levels in a globally consistent classification hierarchy. So here's an example of a hierarchy that's called the International Vegetation Classification. It covers most of North America and some of Central America. And basically, as you go from the upper levels, you can see they're very broad, kind of vague, forest, woodland, and then it becomes more climatically divided, cool, temperate forest and woodland, and then geographically divided into Vancouverian. And basically, as you go down levels, you get more and more detailed until you reach our friend, the Garry Oak Ocean Spray community at the finest level association. Now, what we've determined through talking to experts is that the best level for KBAs, because this is a global standard, we can't go so fine that it isn't really relevant in other countries. So we need to go up a couple of levels. So the group level is generally where we're working with, or where we're aiming to work with, and sometimes the alliance level. So because BC has mapped its ecological communities generally at that very fine scale, there's a little bit more work that I'm still doing to assess the relationships between BC's communities and things like this International Vegetation Classification to understand those relationships with these different classification levels. The second piece of information we need is the ecosystem threat status. So one of the other cool pieces of information that we can get from the BC CDC is right there. So you can see conservation status. This ecosystem type is rated as globally G1 and provincially S1. S stands for subnational. There is also an N rank, but it's not listed here, which would be a national one. And that means it's the most endangered it can get, basically. It's a critically imperiled ecosystem type. The system that we are supposed to use in the KBA system is the red list of ecosystems. So this is a different way of assessing threats to ecosystem. It's an international class ranking system, basically, that looks at threats and gives an ecosystem similar results to basically the conservation status in the G rank and the S rank, but it is a slightly different methodology. So right now we're trying to look at how do the S, N, and G ranks align with this red list of ecosystems for the ecosystems. We're looking at how conservation status ranks applied at that very fine scale in the classification, so that association scale could translate or move up to levels where KBA site identification takes place. And then are there any ecosystems where we could actually perform a red list assessment to use for KBA? So a little bit more work there too. And then finally, I'll give you an example. If we actually could meet, once we have those pieces of information all fall into place, how would we make a site for ecosystem? So here again is the distribution mapped of that Garry Oak Ocean Spray community. Let's zoom into the Victoria region and getting close to Oak Bay, where there were so many KBAs already, which is amazing. So here's a picture of mapped ocean spray in this Mount Douglas Park area in Gordon Head there. Now, we remind ourselves of the thresholds that we have to meet at this site. If this ecosystem is critically endangered or endangered, a site has to have 5% of all of the ecosystem. If it's vulnerable, it has to have 10%. And then we look at our ecosystem data. So as we saw on the previous slide, this ecosystem has a threat status of G1, which equals critically endangered. I fudged this number a little bit because we don't have all of the information we quite need yet. So around 3.7 kilometers squared could be the full extent of this mapped ecosystem type. And then the extent in this inset map here is 0.41 kilometers squared. Divide those up and you get the site containing 11% of the ecosystem. So this site, this imaginary site, would meet criteria. So we could then draw a boundary around it and we would have a new KBA to explore. So those are the steps that we will be following to produce A2 and B4 KBAs. Now I'm going to quickly give you an overview of this other criteria on high ecological integrity. I know it's getting late, so we'll try not to take too much more of your time, but this is a really cool one, so I hope you can stick around for it. Criterion C identifies large regions of high ecological integrity. So what that means is we're looking for areas with very little to no industrial disturbance, where the overall health of the land, waters, and species is very high. What we've immediately found is that because there's been so much development in the south of Canada, these large and healthy landscapes are predominantly either in the north or in very rugged regions, and they all occur on Indigenous homelands. And in fact, in many cases, much of the good condition that is there is a result of how the Indigenous peoples who occupy the land and the land care for and support one another. So there's very close interrelationships between high ecological integrity and Indigenous peoples. And one of the cool things about Criterion C is that in these types of KBAs, we can very explicitly highlight both ecological and cultural values. So we're in BC, where we would find most of the regions that you'll see in yellow that don't have current significant industrial development, which you'll see in the map in blue, are found in the Central Rockies, along the rugged parts of the coast, and in the north. So here's a map of BC. As you can see, blue is development, human footprint of industrial development, and the yellow regions are the areas with the least amount of development overall. It's very important to us that this work considers both Western science and traditional knowledge as essential ways of knowing about regions, supports traditional land uses, land management planning, and regional conservation efforts, and really just highlights the knowledge and stewardship of Indigenous peoples and communities that have contributed so much to these healthy ecosystems. So currently we are exploring different paths towards understanding and recognizing the important ecological and cultural values in these places, and that includes reviewing previously documented information on what indicates or what metrics exist on ecological and cultural integrity. We are collaborating wherever possible with Indigenous communities to share knowledge with each other and learn more about how we can tell if the land is healthy from the people who actually live in these places and know them best. And then with those pieces of information, we're working to develop products that both help us understand ecological and socio-ecological integrity and identify potential KBAs, as well as also could be useful for the Indigenous communities living in these places and their priorities for land use, land management, and conservation. So overall, KBA Criterion C provides us some opportunities to develop a deep understanding of ecological integrity by defining it using these complementary knowledge systems. Use KBAs in a way to bring global attention to the key role that Indigenous cultural values and practices have played in maintaining these healthy landscapes within Canada, and identify additional ways to support Indigenous-led conservation through the KBA initiative. And really what we need to know now is from knowledge holders in these places, what ecological and cultural values are most important to maintain on the land now and in the future. And that's our next step. We're following those trails to learn more about these high ecological integrity places. So I think Peter has already, or will already, put our emails in the chat, and mine is there on the bottom as well. I'm always happy to talk to anybody with interest in these ecosystem criteria. Thank you very much for hanging out with us on this evening, and I will end my show.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Lucy. Thanks so much, Ian. Thanks so much, Liam. And thanks to all of you for joining today, and and sitting around for these great talks. So we'll move over to the questions. We have about 12 minutes before we get to kind of the end of our allotted time. There's one question in the chat already, which we'll start off with, and then anyone else, feel free to raise your hand or kind of drop in the chat if you have a question as well. So a question from Kim: who can I contact regarding the recovery work being done at the Nukit Tobacco Plains KBA, in particular work being done in Spalding's Campion habitat? Ian, I'll pitch this one over to you.
Yes, that'll be me. Yeah, thanks, Kim. Thanks for the question. I'll follow up with that with you in email. I'll get you in touch with folks. They're both with Yakutat Nukit, and the province is doing some work looking at Spalding's there. So yeah, and again, appreciate the information that you provided helped us bump that up from a national KBA to a global one. So that's in the review at the global secretariat right now. So appreciate that. Move on. Shane Johnson, Harewood Plains and Nanaimo, add any consideration? Yes, actually, I haven't drafted anything yet, but Wiley Thomas had reached out to me with some of the recent work that's been done there, and it certainly looks like it will be meeting KBA criteria. So I'd be looking forward to delineating that and moving that site forward in the near future.
There was no other questions in the chat, but anyone feel free to unmute yourself and ask away as well. There was a question earlier that I know is answered already, but it might be worth discussing just so others who didn't see have a chance to learn as well, which was about how the KBA is coordinated with the Mesquite Bay Conservation Area. Liam, do you maybe want to just chat briefly about that and summarize your answer from the chat there?
Sorry, I was just looking at just doing some research at the last question put up by Shane Johnson. Could you repeat the one you were talking about?
Yeah, no worries. Yeah. How is the KBA coordinated with the Mesquite Bay Conservation Area in Haida?
Oh, yeah. I commented below that we work really closely with the Mesquite Bay Conservation Society. They're kind of one of our go-to partners on the island. We also have our caretakers there. But in the last 2 years, we provided funding to the organization, and they have in turn helped us organize 3 different surveys. I think it was 4 days of surveys during the herring spawns in Guayhanas to try and establish if they had similarly strong bird populations to other herring spawns in the south, because they hadn't really been surveyed before. A winter count in Skidegate Inlet, and a offshore count of Lawn Point to try and pick up on Pacific loon numbers. So yeah, work quite closely with them.
Thanks. I've seen an email from Jeanette, very interested in work being done in traditional territory. Who should I email? Feel free to email any one of us there, Jeanette. I'll paste the emails. Maybe I can pin them in the chat or something.
And we get there. I'll add in, Jeanette, there's several KBAs in Sinike's territory. They're in Lower Columbia area, and yeah, it'd be great to touch base with you, with James Baxter and Nelson, and connect with Sinike's on those.
Awesome. And another one, I think maybe for Ian, what's the timeline for the Chilliwack River Valley to reach status, or what's the timeline, rough timeline there?
That's a good question. Certainly, it is currently, I think I'm trying to get it out for technical review in the near future. So the review process is picking up. Our initial process was taking quite some time. We're having some sites now that have been in review for well over a year or more. My hope is, I think as we're getting things a bit more streamlined on that review process, hopefully it will go this will go a bit more quickly. I'm not going to take a guess as to when it would be complete, but we are certainly committed to seeing it through to completion.
Thanks for that. Yeah, always hard to pinpoint those exact timelines because it's just so dependent on others getting back as well. And in the case of that,
I would say, Lee, if your information or feel qualified to review that either from a technical aspect on any of those species that we listed there or at the general stage, please do reach out to me. Send the emails in the chat. I'll throw it here again. Yeah, please, it'd be great to hear from you.
For Lucy, will the high oh, sorry, Liam, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry, I thought I interrupted somebody. Never mind. For Lucy, will the high ecological integrity criterion be applied to marine areas as well?
Yeah, it certainly could. We haven't delved too deeply in marine ecosystems for any of the criteria just yet. I don't know how deeply we've gone for species criteria either, other than for seabirds. It presents a new set of challenges, and but yes, the KBA criterion C could apply to marine, freshwater, terrestrial, subterranean, who knows, basically any ecosystem type that falls within an ecoregion.
Awesome. Do you know if globally they're looking at that at all, or yeah?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Do you know if they're looking at that globally, like elsewhere?
Yeah, I've heard a few places. I think coral reef ecosystems are of great interest in a few regions. But again, I think the mapping of marine ecosystems presents even more challenges than mapping of terrestrial ecosystems. But yeah, it's definitely could apply, and there is interest, and it would be an important place if we could find a high ecological integrity marine ecosystems. It'd be amazing.
We have been in touch with Cherise Dupree, I think, so with DFO, who had recently, late winter, had a coral reef, very unique coral reef in Finlayson Channel on the north coast, about potential there, because when I see things like that, it just sort of screams KBA to me. We've endeavored to look into some of the glass sponge reefs in the Salish Sea. Some of the hydrothermal vents well off the west coast of Vancouver Island could potentially be both ecosystem species, ecological integrity. There's certainly lots of opportunities there, but as Lucy said, that it's difficult data for us to work with, and we keep reaching out to DFO partners and hoping for the best.
Another question from Richard in the chat. Will species at risk survey results to support KBAs feed into future COSEWIC stats reports? Interesting to see such data leads to higher population estimates and needs to reevaluate KBA. Interesting to see if such data leads to higher population estimates and needs to reevaluate KBA thresholds. Yeah, good question. And it does bring to mind as well, we didn't mention this today, but all the species KBAs, or all the KBAs rather, are meant to be reassessed every 8 to 12 years to kind of reflect that kind of shifting, true population status, and then our understanding of distributions and abundance as well. So in theory, every KBA every 8 to 12 years gets reassessed. Species might continue to meet criteria, they might no longer meet criteria, and boundaries might change and stuff as well. So far, there's no direct process or pipeline between KBAs and COSEWIC. We definitely kind of, as soon as those new reports come out, Ian and others are kind of looking at those to see what new stuff meets criteria and how that shifts the work, but it doesn't yet work the other way. So COSEWIC doesn't immediately get KBAs to, see how those affect other designations or feed those into reports or anything. It could be an interesting partnership to explore more. Seeing something from Lee as well, who's just commenting that she and Dennis Nope had worked with, or they and Dennis Nope had worked with tall bugbane, coast salamander, and Pacific water shrew in Chilliwack River Valley. And then from Nicola, would Cable Bay area be similar as Fairwood Plains in Nanaimo? Ian, was Cable Bay on your radar at all as well?
No, and I don't think so. It'd be interesting, yeah. Nicola, if you could send me an email, please, on that, to be interested. Yeah, certainly see where it is. There's a couple sites in and around Nanaimo that we're looking at. Butter tubs is another one with turtles. But yeah, certainly be interested in learning more about Cable Bay area. It could be, and there is a IBA, little Qualicum, and a bunch of other things, IBA, I forget the name. Liam, you might know more about that. Does that get far enough down towards that area? You know that coast better than me.
Just double checking that bay specifically.
It's closer.
Oh,
It's-
sorry, you cut out.
It's closer to Nanaimo, near Dodd Narrows.
I will shoot a message in the chat as soon as I get this on the map.
We've got a couple of minutes left on the time, so if there's any last questions, throw them in the chat or unmute yourself there. But we'll try to wrap up this loose end at least before we log off all.
I was a comment there, Sarah Dudas, about Lophelia Reef. That was one I was mentioning that I think Charisse Dupreez was involved with up in Finlayson Channel. She's a very busy person. If you know more about it, either individual species or some of the ecosystem aspects to it, it would be great to include it, to look at it more closely.
Yeah, I'll send you a message, Ian. I know Charisse is very busy. It is a very exciting discovery, though, and definitely has some great common themes between the terminology we use in DFO, the EBSA terminology, amongst other things. So it's been really interesting to hear the KBA side of things. Lots of ideas kind of floating around in my brain on the marine side of things as I'm listening. So I'll send you an email and we can chat offline. But thank you for all these awesome presentations. It's really interesting.
Great. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of the 30 minutes. Thanks so much, everyone, for staying on and for the great questions, for paying attention, and also for just caring about biodiversity so much. I know so many people here as well have supported the program, either sharing species information previously or maybe in the future now, given some of these directions of questions and comments in the chat. So, and then of course, I know a lot of people as well, you know, diehard bird watchers and naturalists as well that are contributing to iNaturalist that we use so much, and eBird and other sources as well. So thanks everyone. Thanks of course to all the presenters here today as well, and everybody take care and visit a KBA near you soon.
See you in the field.
Night all.
Night.